There was a time when people used to describe food with words that had nothing to do with health. They said it was rich. They said it was satisfying. They said it reminded them of something their grandmother made, or something they ate on a summer evening that stuck with them for years. They talked about flavor the way you talk about a memory. Specific, deep, impossible to fake. And then, quietly, that language disappeared. It didn't vanish all at once. It was traded in, calorie by calorie, gram by gram, until the most common thing people said about food wasn't that it tasted good, it was that it was good for them. And somehow, along the way, those two ideas became opposites. In the 1980s, fat became the enemy. Not just in scientific journals or government recommendations, in grocery stores, in commercials, in the way people looked at their plates. Fat was reframed as the thing standing between the population and health, and the response was immediate. Food companies scrambled to remove it. Low-fat and fat-free labels appeared on everything from yogurt to salad dressing to crackers that had never contained much fat to begin with. It wasn't just a trend, it was a restructuring. But fat does something in food. It carries flavor. It creates texture. It makes you feel full. When you take it out, you're left with a gap, a blank space where satisfaction used to be. So they filled it. They filled it with sugar, with corn syrup, with stabilizers and emulsifiers and modified starches that could mimic the mouthfeel of cream or butter without technically being cream or butter. The ingredient lists grew longer. The flavor profiles flattened. What had once been whole milk yogurt with fruit became a thick, sweetened paste with the texture of pudding and a faint chemical aftertaste that people learned to ignore because the label said it was helping them. And it wasn't just yogurt. Peanut butter, which had been ground peanuts and salt, became a suspension of hydrogenated oils and dextrose. Salad dressings, once emulsions of olive oil and vinegar, became water-based gels thickened with xanthan gum and flavored with concentrates. Even bread changed. To keep it soft without fat, manufacturers added extra gluten, dough conditioners, and sweeteners. A slice of sandwich bread in 1995 had nearly double the sugar of one in 1975. But people were told this was progress. Fat was the problem. Fat clogged arteries. Fat made you fat. And so the industry did what it was told. It removed the fat, it replaced the flavor, and it called the result healthy. What nobody said out loud was that taste had become a problem to solve. If food tasted too good, people ate too much of it. If it was too rich, too satisfying, it was indulgent, and indulgence was no longer morally neutral. It was something to resist. So flavor was filed down, simplified, made safe. The goal wasn't to create something people loved. It was to create something people wouldn't feel guilty about. And it worked. By the mid-1990s, an entire generation had grown up eating food that didn't taste like much. Fat-free cheese that didn't melt, low-calorie frozen dinners that required sauce packets to be edible. Snack cakes made with olestra, a fat substitute that passed through the body unabsorbed, sometimes taking nutrients with it, and occasionally causing what the FDA politely called gastrointestinal distress. But it was on the shelf. It was approved. It was marketed to parents as a responsible choice. Children ate it. Adults ate it. And slowly, the benchmark for what food was supposed to taste like began to shift. A strawberry no longer needed to taste like a strawberry if the label said strawberry flavor. A chicken breast no longer needed to be tender or juicy if it was skinless and fat-free. The experience of eating became secondary to the idea of eating correctly. And people forgot what they were missing. It wasn't just about nutrition labels. It was about reconditioning. The language of food became clinical. Meals were no longer described by how they made you feel. They were described by what they contained. Grams of protein, milligrams of sodium, percentage of daily fiber. You weren't supposed to enjoy food. You were supposed to manage it. Eating was reframed as a series of decisions, each one carrying moral weight. Good food, bad food, cheat day, clean eating. The implication was always the same. Your body was a problem, and food was either part of the solution or part of the threat. Taste was irrelevant. Pleasure was suspicious. If you liked something too much, it probably wasn't good for you. And the industry leaned into that. They created entire product lines based on restriction. 100-calorie packs, sugar-free everything, meal replacement shakes that came in bottles and promised complete nutrition without the inconvenience of cooking or chewing. It was food designed not to be food. It was efficient, portable, optimized, and it tasted like nothing. But it wasn't supposed to matter, because the point wasn't flavor, the point was control. Then something strange started happening. People began to notice that the fat-free diets weren't working, that despite decades of cutting fat and counting calories, obesity rates were climbing, that the promise of health through restriction had delivered the opposite. The science started shifting. New studies suggested that fat wasn't the villain it had been made out to be, that sugar, particularly the kind used to replace fat, might be doing more harm, that the human body needed fat not just for energy, but for hormone production, for nutrient absorption, for satiety. But by then, the damage was done. An entire food system had been restructured around the assumption that fat was bad. Supply chains had been built, formulations had been locked in, consumers had been trained. You couldn't just flip a switch and undo 30 years of product development and public messaging. And more than that, people's palates had changed. A whole generation had grown up on low-fat, high-sugar substitutes. They didn't know what real butter tasted like. They didn't know that yogurt used to be tangy and thin, not thick and sweet. They didn't know that salad dressing was supposed to separate in the bottle because it was made of oil and vinegar, not thickened into a stable emulsion with chemicals. They had been fed substitutes for so long that the substitutes had become the baseline. And when you tried to give them the original, they didn't like it. It tasted too strong, too rich, too real. Their taste had been replaced. There's a term in food science, bliss point. It refers to the precise amount of sugar, salt, and fat that makes a product as appealing as possible. The point at which the brain lights up and says, more. Food companies spent millions engineering products to hit that point. But the bliss point isn't fixed, it shifts. If you eat high-sugar, high-salt foods regularly, your tolerance adjusts. You need more sweetness to register sweetness, more salt to register salt. And if you remove fat and replace it with sugar for 30 years, you recalibrate an entire population's sense of what food is supposed to taste like. You don't just change the food, you change the eater. By the time butter started appearing in healthy recipes again, by the time full-fat yogurt made a quiet comeback, it was too late for a lot of people. They had spent too long eating the replacements. Their palates had been shaped by decades of substitution. Real cream tasted heavy. Whole milk tasted strange. Unsweetened yogurt tasted sour. The food that had once been normal now tasted wrong. And the food that had been engineered in labs, formulated in factories, optimized for shelf stability and profit margins, that was what tasted right. It wasn't just a loss of tradition, it was a loss of discernment. People couldn't tell the difference anymore between something that had been grown and something that had been assembled, between something made in a kitchen and something made in a plant. The ability to taste the difference had been trained out of them. And it didn't stop at taste, because when you replace fat with sugar, you don't just change flavor, you change how the body responds. Fat slows digestion, it signals fullness, It keeps blood sugar stable. Sugar does the opposite. It spikes energy and then drops it. It triggers insulin. It leaves you hungry an hour later. So people ate more. They ate more because the food didn't satisfy them, because it was designed not to. Because a product that keeps you full doesn't get repurchased as often as one that leaves you wanting more. And the cycle continued. There's a picture from a grocery store circular in 1987. It's an ad for Snackwell's Devil's Food cookie cakes, fat-free, low-calorie, and marketed as a guilt-free indulgence. The tagline reads, "So good you won't believe they're healthy." People bought them by the case. They became one of the best-selling cookies in the country. And they tasted like compressed dust held together with corn syrup. But it didn't matter, because they were fat-free. Because the label said you could eat them without consequence. Because taste had already been demoted. What mattered was the permission. And that's what the low-fat era really sold. Not better food, not better health, permission. Permission to eat without guilt, as long as you ate the right things, as long as you trusted the label more than your tongue. It's hard to say exactly when things started to turn. Maybe it was when the science caught up. Maybe it was when people got tired of being hungry. Maybe it was when a new generation of chefs started talking about fat like it wasn't a four-letter word, when they said things like butter makes everything better and didn't apologize for it. But even as the fat-free products disappeared from shelves, even as whole milk and full-fat cheese made their return, something had been lost. The knowledge of what food was supposed to taste like had been interrupted. A link in the chain had been broken. And you can't unbreak it just by changing the products back. Because it's not just about what's available, it's about what people recognize, what they reach for, what their body tells them is normal. And for millions of people, normal is still the taste of substitutes. There are people now in their 30s and 40s who have never tasted real mayonnaise, who have never had butter that wasn't blended with vegetable oil, who think cheese is supposed to come in individually wrapped slices that don't need refrigeration. They're not to blame. They were fed what they were fed. But they also don't know what was taken from them. They don't know that tomatoes used to taste like something other than water and texture, that bread used to go stale in 2 days because it wasn't loaded with preservatives, that a peach in season could be so sweet and so fragrant that you didn't need anything else. They don't know because they were never given the chance to learn. And now, even if you handed them that peach, there's a good chance they'd say it was too messy, too much trouble. They'd reach for the cup of diced fruit in syrup instead. Not because it's better, because it's what they know. The low-fat era didn't just remove fat from food. It removed flavor. It removed satisfaction. It removed the ability to trust your own taste. And in its place, it left a population conditioned to ignore what their mouth was telling them and believe what the package said instead. That's not an accident. That's a feature. This is only one substitution, one chapter in a longer archive. There are others.